A way that a lot of these cases start is that as an investigator, or first as a merchant will be issued essentially a CBP report, or a Common Point of Purchase Analysis report, that essentially shows transactions occurring at that merchant sometime later get used for fraud, and based on analysis done by issuers, they will identify specific merchants as probably having had a problem. And so, unfortunately, there's no uniform way that CBP reports, but basically transactions starting in mid-March were subsequently being used for fraud. And so what the data set we got from the processor here basically showed the date of the legitimate transaction, the location, the card number, and then the amount that was used for the initial transaction. What it didn't give us is where the fraud transaction took place or how much that was worth. But that being said, their fraud started basically for transactions that took place right when COVID hit. And when you think about the timing of that, it sort of makes sense, right? Because most other retail or hospitality locations were closing. It would have been pointless to go after a restaurant, for example, in the middle of March. But what entities were still taking transactions at that time? Gas stations. Obviously, they remained open as an essential business. So what we did was use endpoint monitoring to pull event logs from each of the fuel controllers across the gas station environment, just so we could see if anything was hinky going on within system event logs. And pretty quickly on, what we saw was on March 15th, there is an encoded PowerShell that gets executed against the fuel controller. Right off the bat, we're not sure what this is, but typically encoded PowerShell is not something that's legit. And it's happening right around the start of the fraud. So in decoding that PowerShell, we find that it's making an outbound connection over port 443 to a domain in Russia, and then executing an executable called mxslipstream3.exe, completely not legit. This is not a legit executable in any way whatsoever. What this thing did, and when we ran it in a controlled environment, was create an output file. Output file was called wmsetup.temp, sat in the temp directory, and it itself is encrypted something. Just the fact that this thing is creating an output file full of something gave us a sense that something bad is going on. We're able to use that binary itself to pull decryption keys. I mean, what we know at this point is that at least at the fuel controller that we're looking at for this example, was that starting on the 15th, there were cardholder data being pulled out of memory, dropped into an output file, ostensibly for exfiltration. So the question became how was it that this was introduced, and how did bad guys get access to this environment to even do this? And that gets explained on the next slide. So what occurred here is that, if you can see the date, I realize it's kind of small there, but on the 13th, which would have been the day after most of the country shut down, an HR personnel at this company receives a phishing email, essentially from, and it's very specific in that the HR personnel that received this email was the military recruiter. So his particular job was to get veteran recruitment for employment through this gas station chain. Receives a phishing email that looks very, very specific and frankly good in terms of quality of phishing email directed at him, that once he clicks on that email, that end user workstation is then backdoored. They actually navigate from that user's end user workstation to the coffee shop, like the in-house gas station coffee shop controller. And from just that one Bend, Oregon coffee shop, are able to jump to each of the fuel controllers across the environment, and then deploy that embedded PowerShell, or that encoded PowerShell that we discussed. Again, what makes this interesting is a couple things. One, it's a phishing email, and by all accounts, it's a darn good one. So the initial entry was not some esoteric system vulnerability or unpatched box. It was just a guy that clicked an email. But that secondly, this email comes out, I mean, right after the country essentially shuts down, which to me speaks to threat actor pivoting. They realize that typical retail can't be a target from, March 12th, 13th, 14th onward, and just immediately pivot to those merchants that are going to stay open, like gas stations. So speaking of pivoting, and we've seen this a lot, frankly, before COVID, but it's interesting here, in that this case was largely solved with remediation underway, remediation by way of additional access controls being put in place, obviously the malware being deleted and removed by late May. And so by late May, the bad guys were no longer pulling cardholder data. But May 31st, bad guys come back. They still have some access that hadn't been cleaned up yet, and just pivot. They realize they're not getting card data anymore, so they launch a ransomware attack, which I feel like didn't happen 10 years ago. 10 years ago, attacks were siloed. It was either a business email compromise, or it was a credit card breach, or it was an intellectual property breach, or it was a ransomware, or whatever. It was one thing. And now, basically, if one thing doesn't work, they'll just go to the next. And really, I think, speaks to the drive and motivation for threat actors to monetize access no matter how they can. If they've got access to an environment, even if you think you don't have data that's valuable, they will find a way to monetize unauthorized access to your environment just by pivoting to a different attack method.